For 50 years, the Port of Moses Lake has been an integral part of southern Grant County and the city of Moses Lake. It has helped spur economic growth in the county, brought some of the world's most interesting aircraft to the skies above the city, and turned a possible economic disaster for the community into a thriving, bustling facility that regularly adds jobs to the local economy. It might not have ever been if it wasn't for a decision made in faraway Washington, D.C. in the name of saving defense dollars. In November of 1964, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara announced that Larsen Air Force Base outside of Moses Lake would be closed. The shutdown was part of an overall plan to close 2 naval shipyards, 6 bomber bases, and remove 150 missiles that had served their purpose. The Larsen base would remain open for a year and a half, with Colonel Clyde Owen as the closing commander. The plan was that the base was to be shuttered by the end of June 1966. The community was in shock. Senator Warren Magnuson said at the time, "Don't push the panic button," for he was sure the base could be saved in Congress.
At that time, Larsen Air Force Base was one of the main agencies of economic growth in Moses Lake. They and the base and the UNI sugar plant were the 2 big industries connected here to Moses Lake.
The decision to shut the base was irrevocable, according to an Associated Press story at the time. First to be shut down were the 3 Titan missile sites.
When the announcement of base closure was made in November of '64, almost immediately we started action in closing down the 3 Titan I missile sites. And they were all taken out of combat readiness in the spring of 1965 and went completely out of deal.
In February 1966, most of the B-2 bombers left the base with their crews and support personnel and their families. They were assigned to March Air Force Base in California. When the planes left, the population of the base shrunk to 300 from its peak at 4,000. The KC-135 Stratotankers were transferred to Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane. Meanwhile, a private contractor was hired to finish closing the Titan missile sites.
In February of '66 is when the bombers and the tankers and the flight crews all left, and immediately then we started a fast movement of people off the base.
With the B-52s gone, action was taken to remove the powerful nuclear bombs which went to undisclosed locations. "We got rid of the bombs real fast," Owen said. "We didn't want them around."
The minute the planes left, we had no reason to keep the nuclear weapons unavailable as storage here. So they were moved out. Once again, planes came in and hauled the bombs away.
The residents of the city of Moses Lake had real worries about the Air Force leaving. "The thought around here was that Moses Lake would dry up and blow away," Owen said later. Larsen Air Force Base employed 4,000 and housed 8,000 in a town with just over 11,000 residents. The only other industry in town, besides agriculture, was the UNI sugar plant that employed about 400 people. There were no other industries, Owen said, none whatsoever. It wasn't known how Moses Lake and South Grant County would survive without the $14 million payroll and $6 million that was spent with local suppliers in Washington state. But people of Moses Lake came together to work out a plan that would soon be the Port of Moses Lake. A Larsen Action Committee was immediately formed, led by Big Bend Community College President Dr. Al Phillips. The community invited an official from the Washington State Ports Association to address the group. After that, a port district appeared to be the best option. In the late 1950s, it had been proposed that a large port district be formed encompassing most of Grant County. Since the communities were worried about being in a huge district without local control, the effort failed, and many smaller communities formed their own port districts, all but Moses Lake and Ephrata, so that by 1965, there were already 8 port districts in the county.
They got together, and because there already was 8 port districts existing here in Grant County, and in the state at that time there was about in the 70s, and in many of the places a port district actually ran the air facility that might be connected with it, like the SeaTac is under the Port of Seattle, for example, Bellingham, Tri-Cities. And so somewhere along the line, the people on the committee, including people from Ephrata and Soap Lake, got working on the idea that a port district was the way to go.
The committee at first included Ephrata and Soap Lake, but controversy arose.
Somewhere along the line during the summer of '65, Ephrata people pulled out of the committee. And I think the reason was they were scared that they were going to be gobbled up by Moses Lake, be taxed by the port district, but it was still a Moses Lake function. So they went ahead and formed their own port district and even got out ahead of the Moses Lake group. You had to petition the county commissioners, you had to have a petition and a plan, and in the case of Ephrata, they got on the ballot of the primary election. I think they were holding them in September of 1965, when Ephrata voted to form a port district, and they became officially the port district number 9. Moses Lake people got all their paperwork, the petitions and all, to the county commissioners, and the formation of the Port of Moses Lake was voted on in the general election of 1965. There was a small vote, something in the order of about 3,000 some people voted, and it was 89%, I think, voted in favor of forming a port district.
Washington State first authorized public port districts in 1911 in order to help maritime ports develop public docks, wharves, and other infrastructure. This was done to wrest control of ports from private concerns such as railroads. By the 1960s, the state legislature had expanded the definition of a port to include non-maritime communities. This allowed communities to form taxing districts to support economic projects, including airports. Meanwhile, an engineering firm out of Seattle, R.W. Beck & Associates, was hired by the Moses Lake Development Group in order to assist the transfer of the base to the planned port district. One challenge of forming the new port district was its boundaries.
In the meantime, during the planning of all of this, they had to establish a boundary of what the port would include. And they worked very closely with Jack Petticord, who was the county auditor at that time, and they tried to, in some of the areas, the port boundaries followed closely the boundaries of Moses Lake School District, mainly to the west. And then they had to be careful. They had to go and consider, as far as numbers-wise, as far as dividing up 3 commissioner districts, they had to use it by using voting precincts. And then they had to be careful that they didn't split up a voting precinct. Half would vote, or half would be in the port, and half not. So Jack Petticord, the county auditor, handled most of this. And so he got put on the ballot in November of 1965, and at the same time as the people were voting to approve the formation of a port district, the ports were governed by a board of 3 called commissioners. So they had to elect the commissioners at the same time they were voting to form a port district.
The Moses Lake Port District was formed with the city of Moses Lake roughly in the center of it. It totaled 380 square miles. Petitions were distributed and signed and presented to the Grant County Commissioners on September 13, 1965. 2 weeks later, the commissioners authorized a vote in the general election of November 2, 1965. The official name of the district was Grant County Port District No. 10, Port of Moses Lake. The Larsen Action Committee had a little over a month to convince the people of the district to vote for the port, which would be a taxing authority adding to their property taxes. As it turned out, they needn't have worried. The vote to form a Moses Lake Port District was 1,835 in favor and 201 against. At the same time, 3 port commissioners were elected. The first commissioners for the Port of Moses Lake were Leon Bodie, Floyd Rigsby, and Dan Dunn. Leon Bodie was a veterinarian. Floyd Rigsby had owned Moses Lake Ford since 1956, and Dan Dunn owned Dunn Auto Electric and had been a community leader for years. On November 15, 1965, the Grant County Commissioners passed a resolution certifying the results, and the Port of Moses Lake was born. The Port Commissioners were supposed to take office in January 1966, but that was too long to wait, and they got to work right away, with no salary and paying expenses out of their own pockets. Now, the question was what to do with the facility. At first, the commissioners weren't even sure they'd be able to obtain the base from the government, and if they did acquire it, what could be done there? Proposals that came into the committee included turning the runways into a drag strip, raising chickens in the hangars, or turning the runways into feedlots. The commissioners were so desperate for ideas that they told the drag strip man to write again in 6 months. Eventually, they rejected all those ideas, even though they were told that the land the base was on was only good for raising hogs and chickens. On December 20th, 1965, a month and a half after the formation of the Port District, they issued a plan of action for Larsen Air Force Base after the military left. That plan stated that primarily the Port of Moses Lake plans to acquire, operate, develop, construct, maintain, and regulate the property known as Larsen Air Force Base.
That was all a matter of discussion, just what to use the base for, what to do with it.
The plan also included development of industrial, commercial, transportation, and recreational facilities at the port. It all hinged on being able to obtain the base for the port. This involved dealing with the General Services Administration, or the GSA, that had the task of disposing of the assets of Larsen Air Force Base. The Air Force filed with the Armed Services Committee of Congress in January 1966 to have Larsen declared surplus to the needs of the U.S. Department of Defense, the first step toward having the GSA authorized to dispose of the base. Colonel George Kelly of the Pentagon said in February of 1966 that the GSA was screening other federal agencies to see if they had any use for the base, and the Army Corps of Engineers was doing an inventory as required by law. One federal agency already involved was the Bureau of Reclamation because of the Job Corps facility. Big Bend Community College wanted to use the airport because it offered a program no other two-year college did and very few four-year institutions offered: flight training. The program started in the fall of 1965 with 23 students, one of them a woman.
Right after the announcement was made, Dr. Phillips prepared a tremendous study of exactly what he wanted to do with the area he was requesting to be used at Big Bend College. Even down to the building, what he intended to use a building for. It was a great volume of piece of work. And he presented that to the GSA people when they started coming here. And they got everything that he had put in there, other than he had extended down the flight line, and they'd taken in 2 hangars, and even the operation building, which later became the offices of the port. And we took that back out because that was needed by the Port of Moses Lake, the hangars and all. There are 3 large hangars up at the far end of the airfield that were given to Big Bend College because they had the aviation program going. And we moved the aviation program from municipal over to Grant County by that time in December of 1966.
Ironically, the day the voters approved the Port of Moses Lake, Dr. Al Phillips of Big Bend Community College submitted his resignation effective January 15th. He had accepted the presidency of a new junior college in Dallas, Texas. Samaritan Hospital was also involved in the transition of Larsen to civilian use.
The base hospital was the newest facility we had on the base. That was given to the Samaritan Hospital District, whatever they call themselves.
And, of course, Boeing. In February 1966, Boeing became an ally in the effort of the port to obtain the base.
And at every meeting we had, there was always a Boeing representative there. It was very the intent. Boeing was never going to let anything happen to Grant County Airport as not being available to them.
Boeing had long used Larsen's long runways and uncluttered airspace for flight testing their military aircraft. They still wanted that ability, in addition to now training commercial pilots and testing civil aircraft such as the 727.
Boeing was there representing, and as Dave mentioned, they were going through the final testing of the Stretch 27, and then we went through the testing of the 737 here, and then later on I'll get into 1969 when we went through a great big test program of the 747.
Thomas J. Lane, chief of pilot training at Boeing at the time, said that if Larsen is acquired by the Moses Lake Port District, the training program will be split between Boeing Field and Larsen, with the bulk of the training done at Larsen. Lane added that Boeing was ready to use Larsen as soon as contracts can be drawn up. Boeing was selling 707 and 727 jet airliners around the world, and the pilots needed to be trained. Also, they needed to flight test the new 727-200 stretch version and the soon-to-be-built 737. And even then, Boeing was looking forward to the massive 747, which needed long runways like the ones at Larsen. Boeing Field in Seattle and Payne Field in Everett both suffered from busy airspace and small spaces. People living near the airfields were complaining of the noise of constant landings and takeoffs from those urban airports. Larsen had the empty skies and open area Boeing needed. They could use the facility day or night and not worry about disturbing anyone except maybe some jackrabbits. Also, Boeing's flight program was growing. "Our flight program is expanding daily," said Lane, "and we see no let-up for the next 2 or 3 years. Lane added that they were operating 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, just to keep up. Floyd Rigsby, chairman of the Port of Moses Lake Commissioners, said that the port commissioners were looking for something firm to base these applications on, and this looks like it. Boeing's involvement was sufficient to push the port's case with the GSA over the top. The GSA granted the Port of Moses Lake all the runways and most of the flight facilities. Big Bend was given 3 hangars for use in its flight and aviation maintenance programs, along with land, and the Job Corps was given the land and buildings it occupied.
Big Bend had submitted as a document prepared by the college and Dr. Phillips as to the area they would like to be assigned and given. The Job Corps, it was very evident that the area used by the Job Corps was given to the Bureau of Reclamation, another government agency, because that is exactly where they were located. The only other agent was the base hospital, was assigned to the Samaritan Hospital, the district, the hospital district.
The local hospital district, which operated Samaritan Hospital, was given the base hospital, but soon gave it back. And the port contracted with the U.S. Air Force to manage about 1,200 housing units that were south of the airfield. In 1977, they were turned over to the Grant County Housing Authority. This became known as the Larsen Neighborhood, although most residents still referred to it as the base. While all of these negotiations were happening, Larsen Air Force Base was still operational and at combat readiness status. The challenge was that people were leaving, and it was difficult to run the base with fewer and fewer personnel. Owen said it got tense toward the end.
Actual Air Force, we had sufficient manpower. We pretty well ran the base, even though it was all under the port, belonging to the port. We ran the base all the way up into the fall of 1966, pretty much.
Owen assumed he wouldn't be staying long in Moses Lake once the base was closed. The Vietnam War was escalating in Southeast Asia. In February of 1965, President Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, a bombing operation aimed at cutting off North Vietnamese support for the guerrilla forces of the Viet Cong. Then, later in 1965, for the first time, the U.S. military used B-52s to bomb North Vietnam. B-52s would eventually fly nearly 125,000 sorties during the Vietnam War, dropping 2.6 million tons of ordnance. Owen was assigned to an Air Force base outside of Bangkok, Thailand, a strategic location during the war. Owen thought this was a good assignment after commanding a base nicknamed Moses Hole. He figured that it would also enhance his military career too.
My assignment came from the Air Force to go to be a commander of TOC Lee. They asked that I be removed from the assignment from the Air Force to stay here because I was working very closely with the Larsen Action Committee and at the time with the port people. And I was taken off this assignment.
Owen was working with the new port commissioners while they were getting ready for the transition of Larsen to civilian use, attending meetings of the port commissioners and giving them plans and drawings to help them strategize. Then the commissioners approached Owen with a radical idea. Would he consider retiring from the Air Force to become the Port of Moses Lake's executive manager?
In May of 1966, and this during the period we were getting very well acquainted with everybody, meeting all the deals, the port commissioners approached me to see if I might be interested in taking over as the manager of the newly established. I had still 4 years to go in the military to get my 30 years in. And so I was kind of waiting to see just what kind of an assignment I was going to get when I left here. I had already been assigned to be in charge of an air base north of Bangkok during the Vietnamese War. But this was in Bangkok at a base called Tok Lee. And it would have been a good assignment, but at the time, Harold Stadshog, the mayor, had taken over the head of the president, or the head of he and 2 or 3 others asked me if I would I be concerned if they asked that I be taken off that assignment and remain here and still serve as the closing commander. Apparently we were getting along real fine, and everything was going great. But in May, they made the proposal to me if I would consider being the new manager. Well, I got my new assignment that was not very suitable, so I went ahead and discussed it with my wife and all. I decided at that time then to take my retirement from the military and take the job with the port. And we negotiated the deal. Everything was on a handshake, no written things. And then, so I did retire from the Air Force in October of 30 in 1966. The next morning, I went down to work as the new manager of the Port of Moses Lake.
Owen's wife was going through a sickness, and his mother-in-law had had several strokes and was living with them. The idea of staying in Moses Lake had more and more appeal to Owen after being in the military since 1940. I was getting really fed up and tired of the work. I thought it was time to move on, Owen said.
In May of 66, they approached me to see if I would consider, the port approached me, if I would consider taking my retirement from the military and take over the job as the first manager of the port. That was in May. I didn't make up my decision until I received another assignment from the Air Force to go to another facility. At that time, because of personal reasons, I elected to tell the commissioner I would take the job. I would retire from the military and take the job as a first executive manager.
So he gave up his career in the Air Force to become the first executive manager of the Port of Moses Lake. In October of 1966, the Port Commissioners announced their budget for 1967 at $447,306, and it was announced that Owen would work for the port starting on November 1st. Larsen Air Force Base was shut down by the Pentagon, and the Port of Moses Lake was voted into existence by the citizens of Moses Lake. It had 3 community leaders, Leon Bodie, Floyd Rigsby, and Dan Dunn, as its new commissioners. And they found its executive manager in Clyde Owen, the Air Force colonel tasked with closing the base. The Boeing company had assisted in getting the base for the port and was ready to start flying its new commercial aircraft over the skies of Moses Lake. No one at the time knew what was in store for the port district. Would it fail or succeed? Would it bring economic expansion to Moses Lake and Grant County? Or would it become a white elephant, a liability to the port and the taxpayers? Without the vision and leadership of the men who worked tirelessly to make the port a reality, Larsen Air Force Base may have become a weed-infested slab of concrete. Now it was up to Clyde Owen and the 3 commissioners elected by the community to make sure that never happened, and the port became an asset to the community and justified its taxing authority.